The autumn mists of 1831 rose from the Chesapeake Bay like ghosts seeking absolution, shrouding the waterways of Maryland's eastern shore in a gray veil that seemed to conceal secrets older than the Republic itself. In the slave quarters of Fairhaven Plantation, situated on a narrow peninsula where the Choptank River met the Great Bay, workers gathered in the pre-dawn darkness and spoke in voices that carried both caution and something that might have been hope, discussing an extraordinary event that had unfolded 3 days earlier at the Cambridge slave market, a purchase that defied every assumption they had learned to make about the white families who claimed to own them. According to local legend, what happened that September morning would become a story preserved not just in whispered accounts, but in the careful silence of those who understood that some victories must be protected through discretion, that speaking too openly about certain kindnesses could endanger both the giver and the receiver. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 14 months would challenge everything that Eastern Shore society believed about the fixed boundaries between enslaved and free, between oppressor and ally, revealing that even within slavery's comprehensive brutality, moments of unexpected humanity could create possibilities that the system's architects had never imagined and could not fully control. Maryland's Eastern Shore in the early 1830s occupied a peculiar geography, both physical and moral, a region separated from the rest of the state by the Chesapeake Bay, and characterized by waterways that created opportunities for both commerce and escape in ways that landlocked plantation regions could never replicate. The peninsula's economy depended on a mixture of agriculture and maritime trade, with enslaved people working not just in tobacco and wheat fields, but as watermen, boat builders, sailmakers, and in various trades that gave them knowledge of the bay's tides and currents, skills that could become invaluable for those with courage and opportunity to attempt flight toward the free states that lay tantalizingly close across the water. The proximity to Pennsylvania and Delaware created constant anxieties among slaveholders about escapes. Yet the same waterways that worried planters also sustained their prosperity, creating a contradiction that shaped the region's particular form of slavery. Free black communities existed on the Eastern Shore in significant numbers, perhaps 8,000 by 1830, their very presence creating ambiguities that made surveillance more difficult and that offered potential assistance to those seeking freedom. Some of these free families had achieved their status through manumission by owners experiencing religious conviction or deathbed conscience. Others through self-purchase after years of careful saving. Still others through the legal complications that arose when enslaved people from different states married, or when Maryland's gradual abolition laws created situations where children born after certain dates possessed different legal status than their parents. The result was a social landscape more complex than the simple binary of enslaved and free that characterized Deep South states. A complexity that created both dangers and possibilities for those who understood how to navigate the ambiguous spaces between absolute bondage and complete liberty. Cambridge had become one of the shore's principal commercial centers, its position on the Choptank River making it a hub for agricultural trade and the buying and selling of human beings whose labor sustained the region's declining but still substantial agricultural economy. The slave market operated with a brutal efficiency that attempted to reduce complex human lives to simple commercial transactions, with auctioneers cataloging people's physical capabilities and estimated productive value in language that deliberately obscured the moral horror of treating human beings as fungible property. But even within this system of systematic dehumanization, variations in treatment and circumstance created gradations of suffering that mattered enormously to those experiencing them. Differences between owners who maintained family units and those who separated them without hesitation. Between those who permitted literacy despite legal prohibitions and those who punished any attempt at education with savage violence. Into this world of waterways and moral ambiguity, of declining agricultural fortunes and desperate preservation of social pretensions, came two people whose encounter would expose possibilities that the system preferred to keep invisible. Stories passed down through generations claim that the September morning in 1831, when their lives intersected, began like any market day in Cambridge, with traders displaying their human merchandise, while potential buyers circulated through the crowds making calculations about productive value and investment returns. Among those present was Edmund Merrick, a planter whose Fairhaven estate had been in his family for 2 generations, but whose financial situation had deteriorated steadily as soil exhaustion reduced tobacco yields and wheat prices disappointed year after year. He had come to Cambridge that day with the intention of selling rather than buying, planning to liquidate 2 field workers to raise cash that might satisfy creditors who were becoming increasingly insistent about debt repayment. But his wife Lydia had accompanied him despite his suggestion that she remain at home, and her presence would transform the day's events in ways that neither could have fully anticipated. According to oral histories, when the auctioneer brought a man named Kofi to the block, 7 feet and 6 inches tall, with a bearing that suggested both tremendous physical strength and an intelligence that even the degrading rituals of the market couldn't completely suppress, something in Lydia Merrick's expression changed in ways that Edmund would later struggle to understand or explain. She had watched silently through the morning's earlier sales, her face revealing nothing of whatever thoughts occupied her as families were separated and people were sold to buyers whose reputations ranged from relatively humane to notoriously brutal. But when she saw Kofi standing on that platform, chains weighing down his massive frame, while the auctioneer emphasized his extraordinary size and potential for heavy labor, she leaned close to her husband and spoke words that would alter multiple lives. "We must purchase him. Whatever the price, Edmund, we must." The intensity in her voice shocked her husband, who had known her for nearly 15 years of marriage, but had never heard quite that tone of absolute conviction about anything related to the plantation's operations or the enslaved people who worked it. He began to protest that they had come to sell rather than buy, that their financial situation made new purchases impossible, that adding another worker when they could barely afford to maintain their current population made no economic sense. But Lydia's insistence was unyielding in ways that Edmund found both surprising and somehow unsettling, as if she were responding to considerations that had nothing to do with agricultural economics or household management and everything to do with imperatives he couldn't access or comprehend. She told him that if he would not bid, she would find ways to make the purchase through her own family connections. A threat that Edmund understood carried real weight, given that Lydia's merchant father maintained business relationships throughout the region and could easily arrange credit that would humiliate Edmund by revealing his inability to control his own household's financial decisions. So Edmund bid, competing against several other planters who recognized Kofi's obvious value for the heaviest plantation labor, driving the price higher than he could afford until he finally secured the purchase at $1,800, a sum that represented a substantial portion of Fairhaven's annual revenues, and that would push the estate deeper into debts that already threatened its survival. As he completed the transaction and arranged for Kofi to be transported to Fairhaven, Edmund asked his wife what had possessed her to insist on such an imprudent acquisition, what she possibly hoped to accomplish by adding expensive property when their financial situation was precarious at best. But Lydia's response was cryptic in ways that gave him no real answer. Sometimes, Edmund, the moral course and the prudent course diverge. I pray you will understand eventually, though I cannot explain now what I barely understand myself. What Edmund Merrick did not know, what he could not have known given the careful discretion his wife had maintained for years, was that Lydia had been conducting a kind of quiet rebellion against slavery's brutality that manifested in small acts of subversion and assistance that she could never acknowledge publicly without destroying both herself and those she tried to help. She had grown up in Baltimore, daughter of a merchant family whose Quaker influences had created religious convictions about slavery's sinfulness, even as economic interests made open abolitionism impossible in a state whose economy still depended substantially on enslaved labor. When she married Edmund and moved to the Eastern Shore, she had initially tried to suppress her moral discomfort, to accept that plantation slavery was the social reality she had married into, and that her duty was to make the best of circumstances she could not change. But over years of witnessing the system's daily operations, the casual cruelties, the family separations, the systematic denial of humanity to people whose intelligence and dignity were obvious to anyone willing to see, Lydia had begun taking small risks to ameliorate suffering in ways her husband never noticed. She provided medical care that went beyond what economic interest in maintaining productive workers required. She taught household servants to read despite laws forbidding literacy, recognizing that education represented a form of power that might someday prove valuable for those who possessed it. She maintained quiet contacts with free Black families in Cambridge and the surrounding area, relationships that Edmund assumed were simply the social connections appropriate for a plantation mistress, but that actually created networks through which information and occasionally assistance could flow in directions that slaveholding society would have found intolerable had they understood what was actually happening. When Lydia saw Kofi on that auction block, she had recognized something in his expression that suggested he possessed not just physical strength, but strategic intelligence that was actively assessing his circumstances and calculating possibilities, even in that moment of absolute vulnerability. She had also noticed details that the male bidders focused on labor potential overlooked. The scars on his back that suggested previous owners had attempted to break his spirit through violence. The way he held himself despite the chains in ways that communicated unbroken dignity, and most significantly, the way his eyes tracked everything happening around him with an attention that suggested someone gathering information that might eventually prove useful. In that moment of recognition, Lydia had made a decision that she could not fully articulate even to herself. That if she could purchase this man, she would find ways to use her position to help him survive, and perhaps eventually to facilitate his escape to freedom. Kofi arrived at Fairhaven on a September evening, when the air carried the first hints of the autumn cold that would soon make the bay's waters treacherous for all but the most experienced watermen. Edmund assigned him immediately to the most demanding labor, clearing new ground for cultivation, moving massive logs that would require teams of normal-sized workers, breaking soil too root-bound for standard plowing. The work was brutal by design, Edmund believing that establishing dominance over new acquisitions required demonstrating immediately that their size or strength offered no protection from the total authority that ownership conveyed. But what Edmund did not observe, what the plantation's routines made invisible to him, was that Lydia began finding reasons to interact with Kofi in ways that seemed routine from outside observation, but that actually created opportunities for communication that would have scandalized and enraged her husband had he understood what was actually occurring. She would bring water to workers in the fields, a practice that Edmund viewed as appropriate concern for valuable property, but that gave Lydia opportunities to speak briefly with Kofi in ways that other workers could not easily overhear. She assigned him to repairs on outbuildings near the main house, tasks that required his strength, but that also placed him in proximity where brief exchanges could occur without attracting attention from overseers or other enslaved workers who might feel obligated to report unusual interactions. Most significantly, she ensured that he was assigned to maintenance work on the plantation's dock and boats. Labor that Edmund viewed as logical given Kofi's strength, but that actually served Lydia's carefully concealed purposes by giving him knowledge of the watercraft and waterways that could prove essential if escape ever became possible. Through these carefully orchestrated interactions, Lydia communicated information that Kofi understood immediately was dangerous for both of them, but that represented possibilities he had almost stopped believing existed. She told him that she opposed slavery on moral grounds, that she maintained contacts with free Black families who could provide assistance to those seeking escape, that she would help him when the time came, though they must both be extraordinarily cautious about when and how such assistance could be provided without creating suspicions that would endanger everyone involved. Kofi listened to these communications with a mixture of hope and wariness, understanding that even well-intentioned white people often lacked the resolve to follow through when helping enslaved people escape required real risks to their own security and social standing. But he also recognized that Lydia was offering possibilities that his circumstances would likely never provide again, and that refusing assistance from unexpected sources because they seemed implausible would be a form of self-defeating caution that kept people enslaved when freedom might be achievable through calculated risk-taking. The fall and winter of 1831 brought a period of careful preparation, during which Lydia and Kofi developed methods of communication that allowed coordination without creating the kind of visible connection that would alarm Edmund or the plantation's overseer. She would leave items in specific locations, a particular tool placed in an unusual position, a cloth of specific color hanging in a window that conveyed messages about when brief conversations might be possible. He would complete assigned tasks in ways that created legitimate reasons to be in areas where they could exchange a few words without observers close enough to overhear. The system was cumbersome and slow, requiring patience that tested both their nerves as months passed without clear movement toward actual escape. But the caution was necessary given the catastrophic consequences that discovery would bring for both of them. During this period, Kofi learned from Lydia information that proved essential for understanding the possibilities and dangers of attempting flight from the eastern shore. She explained the geography of escape routes toward Pennsylvania, the locations of free Black communities that might provide assistance, the schedules of patrols that monitored roads and waterways for enslaved people traveling without passes. Most crucially, she described contacts in Cambridge who maintained connections to the networks that would later be romanticized as the Underground Railroad, but that in 1831 were far more improvised and precarious than legend suggested. Groups of free Black people and sympathetic whites who took enormous risks to assist those seeking freedom, but who operated with necessary caution that meant assistance could never be assumed and had to be carefully coordinated to minimize the chances of betrayal or discovery by slave catchers, who operated with both legal authority and financial incentives to recapture people attempting escape. Kofi absorbed this information while simultaneously learning everything he could about the waterways surrounding Fairhaven, knowledge that he acquired through the boat maintenance work that Lydia had arranged for him. He studied the tides and currents of the Choptank River and the Chesapeake Bay, understanding that navigation of these waters required expertise that could mean the difference between successful escape and drowning or recapture. He memorized the locations of safe harbors and dangerous shoals, learned to read weather signs that predicted when conditions would be favorable for small boats attempting to cross the bay toward the western shore, where connections to northern escape routes were more readily available. He observed which enslaved watermen possessed skills and knowledge that might prove valuable if he could enlist their assistance. Though he was careful about revealing his intentions, given that desperation sometimes made people betray others in hopes of winning favor from masters or avoiding punishment for knowledge they possessed but had not reported. By spring of 1832, the careful preparations that Lydia and Kofi had maintained for months began moving toward actual implementation, as circumstances created an unexpected opportunity. Edmund Merrick's financial situation had deteriorated to the point where creditors were threatening legal action that would force Fairhaven's liquidation through public sale, a humiliation that would destroy what remained of the family's social standing. Lydia understood that such a sale would likely result in Kofi being sold south to Deep South cotton or sugar plantations, where life expectancy was measured in years, and where any possibility of escape would be far more difficult than on the eastern shore with its proximity to free territory. She communicated to Kofi through their established methods that he should prepare to attempt escape within weeks, that she would create the conditions necessary for flight, but that timing would depend on circumstances she could not fully control. The opportunity came in May 1832, during a period when Edmund traveled to Annapolis to meet with creditors and lawyers about Fairhaven's financial situation, leaving Lydia in practical control of the plantation's daily operations. She had prepared for this moment through careful accumulation of resources that would not be immediately missed. Food that could sustain someone for days. Clothing suitable for travel. Most crucially, a small boat that had been quietly repaired and provisioned as if for routine maintenance, but that was actually prepared for a journey across the Chesapeake toward the western shore. On the night of May 15, 1832, she sent word to Kofi through signals they had established, communicating that he should come to the dock after the plantation had settled into sleep. What happened during their final conversation that night became part of oral traditions, preserved across generations, though the actual words exchanged remained known only to the two people present. According to accounts passed down through free Black communities who assisted Kofi's flight, Lydia provided him with detailed instructions about navigation across the bay, contacts he should seek on the western shore who could provide further assistance toward Pennsylvania, and most remarkably, papers that identified him as a free Black waterman traveling on legitimate business, forgeries that Lydia had obtained through her Baltimore connections at considerable risk and expense. She told him that he should leave immediately, that weather conditions were favorable for crossing the bay, that she would create explanations for his disappearance that would delay pursuit long enough to give him a chance of reaching safety. Kofi's response, as preserved in stories told among those who helped him, acknowledged both his gratitude for assistance that he had never expected to receive from someone of Lydia's position, and his recognition that she was taking risks that could destroy her own life if her role in his escape were discovered. He promised that he would survive and reach freedom, that he would find ways to send word that would let her know her assistance had achieved its purpose, without creating evidence that could be used against her if investigations occurred. Then he went to the boat that she had prepared, pushed off from Fairhaven's dock, and began navigating across the dark waters of the Choptank River toward the Chesapeake Bay and the freedom that lay beyond it. The crossing of the Chesapeake Bay that night required every bit of knowledge that Kofi had acquired through months of observation, and the navigation skills he had learned from watching enslaved watermen who had worked these waters for years. The bay's currents and winds could overwhelm inexperienced sailors, and crossing in darkness multiplied the dangers through reduced visibility and increased likelihood of becoming disoriented in waters that looked identical in every direction. But Kofi had studied the stars and learned to use them for navigation, had memorized landmarks visible even at night, had developed understanding of how the bay's waters moved that allowed him to work with currents rather than fighting them. The journey that night covered nearly 20 miles of open water, requiring hours of continuous rowing and sailing that pushed his extraordinary strength to its limits. But as dawn broke, he approached the western shore near a location that Lydia had identified as relatively safe for landing. What followed after Kofi reached the western shore involved networks of assistance that operated largely outside documented history, preserved primarily in oral traditions maintained by free Black communities and the few white families who risked their own security to help those escaping slavery. According to these accounts, Kofi made his way to contacts that Lydia had arranged, people who provided shelter, while word was sent to connections further north about a fugitive who required assistance reaching Pennsylvania. The journey from the Chesapeake's western shore to free territory required weeks of careful travel, moving at night and hiding during daylight, depending on the courage and generosity of people who faced severe legal penalties if their assistance were discovered, but who maintained their commitment to helping those seeking freedom despite the personal risks involved. By June 1832, fragmentary records suggest that Kofi had reached Pennsylvania and was making his way toward Philadelphia, where free Black communities could provide assistance with establishing new identity and finding employment that would allow him to support himself in freedom. What happened to him after reaching free territory remains largely unknown, swallowed by the deliberate discretion that fugitives maintained to avoid providing information that could be used to recapture them or endanger those who had assisted their escape. Some oral histories claim he eventually made his way to Canada, recognizing that even in free states, the Fugitive Slave Act created risks of recapture that only British territory could fully eliminate. Others suggest he remained in Philadelphia, working under an assumed name and building life in freedom while maintaining careful silence about his origins and the circumstances of his escape. Back at Fairhaven, Lydia maintained the deception she had prepared, claiming initially that Kofi had disappeared during the night and suggesting various explanations ranging from drowning to kidnapping by slave traders to simple flight toward assumed freedom. Edmund Merrick, returning from Annapolis to discover his most expensive acquisition had vanished, was furious about the financial loss, but also desperately anxious about what Kofi's escape suggested about security at Fairhaven and his own competence as a plantation manager. He organized searches and offered rewards, contacted slave catchers, and placed advertisements in newspapers describing Kofi's distinctive height and offering payment for information leading to his recovery. But the trail had gone cold with remarkable speed, as if Kofi had vanished into networks that knew how to conceal fugitives in ways that frustrated even experienced slave catchers with legal authority and financial incentives to pursue escapees aggressively. Whether Edmund ever suspected his wife's role in Kofi's disappearance remains uncertain from the fragmentary evidence that survived. If he did develop suspicions, he never acted on them publicly, perhaps because accusing Lydia would require acknowledging that his own household had subverted his authority in ways that would destroy what remained of his reputation. Or perhaps because on some level he preferred not knowing details that would force him to confront moral complexities that his entire social position depended on ignoring. Lydia maintained careful silence about her involvement, understanding that even years later revelation could endanger both herself and others who had participated in Kofi's escape. The financial loss from his disappearance, combined with other pressures, eventually forced Edmund to sell Fairhaven in 1834. The family moving to Baltimore, where Edmund's failure as a planter could be obscured by urban anonymity, and where Lydia could maintain more open contacts with anti-slavery networks that operated with slightly less risk in the city than on the plantation-dominated Eastern Shore. The impact of Kofi's escape rippled through enslaved communities and anti-slavery networks in ways that official records never captured, but that oral traditions preserved across generations. For enslaved people on the Eastern Shore, the story of someone so distinctive escaping successfully despite every apparent disadvantage his size created became proof that freedom was possible even when circumstances seemed hopeless. That careful planning, combined with assistance from unexpected sources, could overcome surveillance and control mechanisms that appeared comprehensive. The tale spread through the networks connecting enslaved communities across plantations, and through the waterways that connected watermen who carried information along with cargo, becoming part of a larger tradition of escape narratives that sustained hope and provided practical knowledge about how resistance could succeed when executed with sufficient intelligence and courage. For the networks that assisted fugitives toward freedom, Kofi's escape demonstrated the crucial importance of allies within slaveholding households. People whose positions gave them access to resources and information that could make the difference between successful flight and recapture. Lydia's role, though it could never be publicly acknowledged while she lived in slave states, became known among those who coordinated assistance. encouraging others who felt moral discomfort with slavery to move beyond passive disapproval toward active assistance, despite the personal risks such involvement entailed. The story suggested that even within slavery's comprehensive brutality, individuals could choose to act according to conscience rather than social convention. That moral courage sometimes required not dramatic public gestures, but quiet acts of subversion that would never receive recognition or reward beyond the knowledge that they had helped others achieve freedom. The deeper truth that emerges from Kofi and Lydia's story transcends the specific details of one escape from one Maryland plantation in 1832, revealing essential insights about resistance, moral choice, and the possibilities that existed even within systems designed to make freedom impossible. Their experience demonstrates that slavery, despite its comprehensive legal structures and systematic violence, could never achieve the total control that its ideology claimed, that the system depended on cooperation from people whose conscience or calculation might lead them towards subversion rather than enforcement. Every enslaved person who successfully escaped did so not just through their own courage and intelligence, but through assistance from others who took risks that their positions and privileges made particularly costly, creating chains of support that connected people across the rigid boundaries that slavery attempted to maintain between black and white, enslaved and free. Kofi's story also illuminates the crucial role that geography played in shaping possibilities for resistance and escape. The ways that the Chesapeake Bay's waterways created opportunities that landlocked plantation regions could never replicate. The knowledge and skills that enslaved watermen possessed, navigation, boat handling, understanding of tides and weather, represented forms of power that could be turned toward freedom when circumstances permitted. Advantages that plantation owners simultaneously depended on economically and feared for their implications regarding enslaved people's capabilities and potential for autonomous action. The proximity to free states that made Eastern Shore slaveholders anxious also meant that successful escape required crossing relatively short distances compared to the hundreds of miles that Deep South fugitives faced. Though the Chesapeake's waters themselves presented dangers that killed many who attempted the crossing without adequate preparation or favorable conditions. Perhaps most significantly, the story reveals the complex moral landscape that existed even within slaveholding families. The ways that individual conscience could lead people toward actions that contradicted both their economic interests and their social positions. Lydia Merrick's assistance to Kofi represented a form of resistance that was neither simple nor cost-free, requiring years of careful preparation and sustained courage to maintain deceptions that discovery would have destroyed her marriage and social standing, while potentially resulting in legal prosecution. Her choices demonstrated that even people whose positions gave them power within oppressive systems could choose to use that power subversively. That moral courage sometimes manifested in quiet, persistent refusal to fully cooperate with evil, even when open opposition was impossible. The legacy preserved in oral traditions about Kofi and others like him speaks to the fundamental truth that slavery was always contested, always resisted, always undermined by the very people it sought to reduce to property, and by some of those whose positions gave them power within the system, but whose consciences led them toward subversion rather than enforcement. Every successful escape represented not just individual achievement, but collective action involving networks of people who risked their own security to assist others toward freedom, creating traditions of resistance that would eventually contribute to slavery's destruction, even when individual participants never lived to see that ultimate triumph. These stories preserved knowledge about courage and cooperation that official documents systematically excluded, maintaining across generations the understanding that freedom was achievable through strategic action and mutual assistance, that even the most comprehensive oppression contained vulnerabilities that intelligence and moral courage could exploit. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities preserved when official history tried to erase them, that resistance stood 7 feet 6 inches tall, using knowledge gained through forced labor to navigate toward freedom across waters that separated bondage from liberty, assisted by an unexpected ally, whose position within slaveholding society gave her both the means and the moral conviction to help someone escape the system she could not openly oppose, but could quietly subvert through carefully calculated acts of conscience that she would never receive credit for, but that changed lives in ways that rippled across generations. Kofi's journey from the auction block in Cambridge to freedom in the North lasted barely 9 months from purchase to escape. But his story became part of the traditions through which enslaved communities preserved hope and practical knowledge about resistance. Proof that freedom was possible even when circumstances seemed hopeless, that moral courage could be found in unexpected places, that the waterways which sustained the Eastern Shore's economy could also carry people toward liberty when knowledge, preparation, and assistance created opportunities that surveillance and control could not fully eliminate.